For 40 years, the galaxy had a question it stopped asking. The Bristol sector, a region of space that should have been a bustling corridor for Transarm shipping, had become a graveyard without bodies. 31 vessels from a dozen species had entered its boundary and simply ceased to exist. No debris fields, no sustained distress signals, no wreckage, no bodies, just silence. The official classification was 4 words that said everything and nothing. Navigation hazard, cause unknown. Charts carried it in 11 scripts. Traffic went around it. The diversion had been priced, normalized, and absorbed into the cost of doing business the way civilizations absorb weather. A hazard was weather. Weather was entered into the models, and the models were obeyed. 4 investigations had been mounted. Each one had assembled at the boundary, taken its readings, found nothing that justified the risk of proceeding, and turned home with its conclusions intact, and nothing whatsoever to show for either. The mystery remained. The question was never answered, until Fleet Captain Villeneuve arrived. The significance of this event cannot be overstated. The Bristol sector represented not merely a navigation hazard but a fundamental challenge to the galaxy's understanding of space itself. An entire corridor of Transarm shipping had been abandoned not because of any known threat, but because of an unknown one that had claimed 31 ships without leaving a single trace. The psychological impact on navigation doctrine was profound. Vessels began taking longer, more expensive routes, insurance premiums skyrocketed, and a shadow of fear settled over every captain who plotted a course near the sector's boundary. The mystery had become a generational wound, a political liability, and a testament to the limits of galactic knowledge. The Assembly required an answer it could enter into a record, and so it had sent the officer it considered the best it had, Fleet Captain Villeneuve, a man whose career had been built on finding patterns where others saw only chaos. To understand the mystery, you must first understand the people who tried to solve it. The low Ryan species had built their civilization on lanes and currents and the keeping of accounts. They were a methodical people, a species that had never needed to rush. Their doctrine held that every loss had an explanation. Every explanation could be found if one looked carefully enough, and the looking was a duty owed to the names in the book. Grief in their culture required mass. A data file weighed nothing. A data file could be set aside, but a physical ledger, a book that could be held, that had weight, that demanded attention. And so the dead were given weight deliberately, 1 page at a time. The ledger held 31 pages. Fleet Captain Villeneuve knew every line the way he knew the joints of his own 6-fingered hands. He had written 2 of the notification letters himself as a younger officer with better penmanship and fewer doubts. He could still recall the texture of the paper. The Tide Mark survey tender, crew of 12, entered the sector and did not leave it. The Coastal Meridian bulk hauler, crew of 40, entered the sector and did not leave it. 29 more from a dozen species in 11 scripts, all transcribed into the ledger in his own careful hand because the originals belonged to navies that were not his. And grief, like cargo, traveled better when it was properly stowed. Each entry was the same in the ways that it should have been different. No debris field, no sustained distress signal, no wreckage recovered for analysis, no bodies. A ship crossed the boundary and then there was no ship. This consistency was itself a pattern, a clue that the investigators had failed to recognize because they were looking for the wrong kind of answer. The low Ryan approach to loss reveals much about their psychology and their limitations. They believed in resolution, that every mystery could be reduced to a clean final state, the way a charted current stops being a mystery and becomes a route. This epistemological framework served them well in ordinary space, where hazards were weather and weather could be modeled. But the Bristol sector was not ordinary space, and the low Ryan doctrine had no category for what they would eventually find. The very strength of their methodology, its insistence on closure, on explanation, on resolution, became a weakness. They approached the sector as a problem to be solved when it was, in fact, a place to be understood. The difference is subtle but profound, and it explains why 4 investigations failed where 1 encounter with humanity succeeded. Villeneuve had been chosen because he was the officer most likely to do what the previous 4 had not, and he intended to. He was not a man given to arrogance. He had spent 30 years finding shapes in fewer data points than 31. He believed, as a matter of doctrine and of temperament, that every loss had an explanation. The sector, whatever it held, was no different in kind from any strait or shoal his people had ever charted. It was only larger and quieter. This confidence was not hubris. It was earned through decades of successful investigation. Villeneuve had built a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw randomness, for finding order in chaos, for resolving the unresolved. He carried this reputation without vanity, the way one carries a tide table, as a tool, not a trophy. The assembly had sent him because they needed an answer, and Villeneuve was the best chance they had of getting one. The human war did not enter into his calculation. The war was real, but it was remote, a cold thing conducted in distant corridors for decades, flaring and settling like a season. No one had ever connected the Bristol losses to it because Bristol losses were filed under weather. Weather was neutral, weather was apolitical, weather killed ships because that was what weather did. Villeneuve did not believe in weather, he believed in patterns. He had 31 data points, and somewhere inside them was a shape. The fact that the war and the sector overlapped in time was, to his mind, coincidence, a statistical artifact with no causal significance. He would later learn how wrong he was, but his error was not a failure of logic. It was a failure of imagination. He could not conceive of a species that would turn a lethal environment into a strategic asset because that was not how his people operated. His people charted hazards in order to go around them. They did not sit down inside them and ask questions until the hazards answered. 1 hour out from the boundary, Villeneuve sat alone with his ledger. 20 minutes out, Miss Cease from the bridge informed him of the threshold approaching. Villeneuve acknowledged, dressed his uniform collar, regarded his own hands for a moment in the amber light, deep naval blue, darkening at the knuckles and joints, steady, and took the corridor forward at a walking pace. This deliberate calm was characteristic of his species. A people who had never needed to rush did not begin in the approach to danger. The crossing itself offered nothing, no drama, no visible threshold, no shimmer on the forward screens. The sector looked like space because it was space, black and indifferent and exactly as charted. The instruments confirmed the expected signature, a low ambient energy reading, slightly depressed against the surrounding volume, noted in every survey for 40 years and explained by none of them. His transponder broadcast their credentials into the dark as doctrine required, and the dark did not answer. He ordered 1/3 speed and a deeper heading. The boundary fell behind them without ceremony, which was, he noted, more than could be said for 31 ships before his. The absence of ceremony was itself a form of information. Previous investigators had expected some kind of threshold effect, a shimmer, a distortion, a detectable transition from ordinary space to whatever lay within. They had found nothing of the sort, and the absence of a measurable boundary had been cited as evidence that the sector was, in fact, ordinary space that merely happened to be dangerous. Villeneuve noted the absence and filed it. He was building a case, entry by entry, observation by observation. He did not yet know what the case would contain, but he knew that every detail mattered, even the details that seemed to say nothing. The sector's silence was not a lack of information, it was a form of information in itself. It told him that whatever was happening in this volume did not announce itself, it did not want to be found, it waited. The wrongness arrived slowly, and it did not arrive through the instruments. The sector felt empty in a way that open space did not. Open space was indifferent, this was vacant. It had the stillness of a harbor cleared before a storm, of a room from which something had been carefully removed. Villeneuve stood at the command rail, studied readouts that insisted nothing was wrong, and found that his secondary membranes had drawn closed vertically across both eyes without his instruction. He let them stay where they were older than doctrine and they had their reasons. This physiological response was deeply significant. The secondary membranes of the low Ryan species were an ancient evolutionary adaptation, a reflex that closed when the environment was perceived as threatening, even if the conscious mind had not yet registered the threat. Villeneuve's body knew something that his instruments did not. The sector was not empty. It was full, and his body was responding to the fullness. 20 minutes inside, Miss C spoke from the sensor station. His voice had changed registers. The first anomaly, the low-energy reading, was not uniform. It carried structure, faint but consistent, a slow modulation that repeated across the volume on a period of some minutes, present in every band they sampled. Not interference, not an artifact of the instruments which had been calibrated twice on his orders before crossing the boundary. The sector's emptiness had a rhythm to it, very deep, very slow, and the nearest language the sensor suite offered for it was respiration, as if something very large was breathing somewhere out in the dark with no interest at all in being heard. This was the first real clue. The sector was not a place. It was a body, or rather, it was a body's environment. Something was living in this volume and it was breathing. The scale was almost incomprehensible, a respiration that spanned minutes, that suffused an entire sector of space, that registered on every band they sampled. The previous investigators had missed it because they were looking for anomalies, not patterns. Villeneuve did not make that mistake. He saw the rhythm and understood that he was not alone. The drain announced itself politely. 3% across every board at once. A deviation so small a less calibrated ship would never have registered it. A less calibrated crew would have logged it for the morning watch. Villeneuve saw it because Miss C saw it, and Miss C saw it because the instruments had been calibrated twice before the crossing on the fleet captain's orders. Engineering flagged it within the minute. External attachment on the hull. Multiple contact points distributed. Nature unknown. Villeneuve's first instinct was the correct instinct for 40 years of ordinary space and the wrong instinct for this sector. Fouled sensor heads, debris adhesion, the mundane housekeeping of any vessel that moved through a universe full of dust. He ordered a diagnostic sweep and a second opinion. The drain doubled before the sweep completed. Then it doubled again. Engineering, following doctrine as engineering should, brought reactor output up to compensate, and the drain rose to meet the new output with a smoothness that no fault, no leak, and no damage profile in any manual he had ever studied could produce. Power went out, more drain came back. The relationship was direct, proportional, and patient. This was the critical insight. The drain was not a malfunction, it was a response. Something on the hull was feeding on their energy, and it was capable of adjusting its consumption to match their output. A leak could be patched, a fault could be diagnosed, a malfunction could be repaired. But a predator, a living thing that was eating their ship's power, could not be fixed by any manual. It could only be outsmarted. Villeneuve stood at the command rail and watched the two curves climb his display in lockstep. He understood that he was not looking at a malfunction. A malfunction does not respond. This responded. He did not know what was on his hull. He knew the shape of what was happening. The shape looked like a feeding. The realization was not accompanied by panic. He was a species that had never needed to rush, and he did not begin now. He observed, he analyzed, and he made a decision that would save his ship. The feedback loop crossing his display gave him perhaps 30 seconds before cascade. He ordered full power down. Everything, drives, reactor, grid, life support to passive reserve. Miss Cease turned from his station. His objection arrived fully formed because low Ryan objections always did. Unknown sector, unknown contacts on the hull. A full power down was a death sentence if anything in this volume was hostile. And everything they knew about this volume said that something was. He was not wrong, he was not even imprudent, he was simply spending seconds and there were 30 of them. Villeneuve did not argue, did not explain, did not raise his voice, because a species that has never needed to rush does not begin in the last 30 seconds of its ship's life. Full power down now. The bridge died around them in the correct order, board by board. The emergency lighting came up low and amber. The drives went silent through the deck plating in a long descending note that every spacefarer feels in the bones and hopes never to feel again. The ship became a drifting object. The ship became, by every measure the sector could read, a thing already dead. The drain stopped climbing. This was the moment of confirmation. The drain was not a mechanical process, it was a biological one. The creatures on the hull were attracted to energy output, and when the output ceased, the attraction diminished. Villeneuve had not solved the problem, but he had bought time. He had demonstrated that the sector could be survived, provided one understood the rules. The rules were simple: output energy and you will be consumed. Cease output and you will be ignored. The 31 ships that had preceded him had done exactly the wrong thing. They had pushed their drives to compensate, had tried to outrun the drain, had treated it as a malfunction to be overcome. They had fed the creatures until there was nothing left. Villeneuve had done the opposite. He had gone dark, he had become a thing already dead, and the creatures had responded by losing interest. The lesson was brutal but clear. In the Bristol sector, survival required the willingness to appear dead. Villeneuve crossed the silent bridge to the nearest viewport and looked out. They covered the hull. A continuous translucent sheet laid across the plating from the bow back toward the drive housing. Made of bodies, each one smaller than his hand, each one nearly invisible alone and unmistakable together. A living skin stretched over his vessel with a faint, slow pulse moving through it in waves. They were not breaching. They were not probing the locks or the seams. They had settled against the residual warmth of his cooling systems the way swimmers settle into a current, and they fed. The pulse that moved through them was the pulse of a thing digesting, not a thing hunting, not attacking. Eating, the sight was both horrifying and beautiful. The creatures were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were not malevolent. They were simply alive, and they were doing what life does, consuming energy to survive. They had no interest in his ship as a vessel or his crew as beings. They were interested only in the heat, the power, the output. They were filter feeders of the void, and his ship was plankton. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not step back from the glass. He stood with the amber light behind him and the dark ahead of him, and he did what he had been sent 400 light-years to do, which was to observe carefully and write it down. Colonial organization coordinated without any visible signal. Density greatest at the drive housing where the warmth was. Wave period regular. Individual size 1 hand or less. Nothing about them suggested malice, and nothing about them needed to. Response to output proportional and immediate. He built the file in his mind, page by page, in his own careful hand, because if he lived, the ledger was going to need it, and if he did not, the habit would at least keep him standing still. This was the defining trait of his species, the refusal to surrender to panic. Even in the face of annihilation, he recorded. Even in the presence of the unknown, he observed. The ledger was not just a record, it was a form of resistance. As long as he was writing, he was not dying. As long as he was observing, he was not defeated. Then the music started. It came through the comms receiver which sat on the emergency bus and had stayed faithfully alive in the dark. And it was a broadcast, external, high amplitude on no channel and in no protocol his people used. It was not language, it was not signal traffic. It was something older and more physical than either. A raw electric charge built into sound, a driving rhythmic pulse that climbed and broke into a hammering rhythm that had no analogy in anything he had ever heard. His membranes drew fully closed, his hands tightened on the rail, and outside the viewport the sheet of bodies answered it. They peeled off his hull in a single flowing movement, every organism at once with no laggards and no stragglers, the whole translucent skin lifting away from the plating and pouring outward into the dark like a tide reversing. And they went toward the source of the broadcast at a speed that made his sensor's memory of them seem slanderous. In under 2 minutes his hull was bare. The drain on his boards, had his boards been alive to show it, would have read 0. The implications of this moment were staggering. The creatures were not merely attracted to energy, they were attracted to specific frequencies. The music was not random, it was a key. Someone had discovered that the creatures responded to a particular pattern of sound, a pattern that, for reasons the science team still did not fully understand, triggered a feeding response so powerful that it could override the creature's existing attachment. The broadcast had peeled them off Villeneuve's hull and drawn them away, turning a lethal situation into a controlled evacuation. But who was broadcasting, and why? The answers would come soon enough, but in that moment, Villeneuve understood that he was not the first to solve the sector's riddle. Someone else had been here before him. Someone else had learned the rules. Someone else had turned the sector into a tool. The mystery of the 31 ships was about to become something far more complicated. The human vessel decloaked off the port bow, mid-sized, a working profile, neither sleek nor new, hull plating patched and weathered, and plainly maintained by people who cared more for the ship than for its appearance. Its running lights came up in sequence, deliberately, the way a vessel lights itself when it wishes to be looked at. No weapons ports opened, no targeting emissions touched his hull. It simply sat there in the middle of the most lethal volume on 40 years of charts, glowing unhurried, while the music from its deployed drone thundered on, and the creature streamed towards it and wrapped it like a garment it had worn before. The human vessel was a contradiction, a warship that did not act like a warship, a vessel that should have been destroyed but was clearly at home. It sat in the heart of the sector as if the sector belonged to it, and in a sense it did. The voice when it came in low Ryan, accented slightly in a way no translator implant produces, learned speech shaped by a living mouth that had taken the trouble. Fleet Captain Villeneuve, please don't restart your drives just yet. Give them another 2 minutes to clear completely. My name is Fleet Admiral H. Horace Nelson. Welcome to the Bristol sector. We have been expecting you for some time. I will explain everything. I find it goes better when I explain everything. Please come aboard when you are ready. Bring your first officer if you like. Leave your weapons aboard if you would. Silence again, except for the music, fainter now, ending. The voice was calm, unhurried, confident. It was the voice of a man who had been here for a long time and had stopped being afraid. Villeneuve looked across the amber bridge at Miss Cease. His first officer stood at his dead station with both membranes drawn fully closed, blind by reflex, a man whose body had decided for him that he did not wish to see the next thing. Villeneuve's own membranes were open. He noted the difference and filed it, and did not yet know which of them it spoke better of. He gave the order to hold the power down and stand the crew easy. Then he went to his quarters and picked up his coat and picked up the ledger. The decision to bring the ledger was significant. It was his badge of office, his record of duty, his connection to the 31 ships that had come before. He would not leave it behind. Whatever he was about to learn, it would be recorded. The station revealed itself in stages. From outside until the last few kilometers, there had been nothing, a void on every instrument. Nelson's vessel docked without ceremony, the way a ship comes home to a berth it has used 1,000 times. From the inside, the station was immense, deck upon deck falling away below the gallery walks, and Nelson explained it without being asked, in the manner of a man honoring a promise. The colony surrounded the station's outer shell. The colony ate its emissions, every band, every signature. The station had no technology of concealment. It had neighbors and nothing crossed the sector boundary in or out except aboard a human-tuned hull. The colony was the wall. Villeneuve noted it and said nothing yet. The explanation was thorough, professional, and eerily calm. Nelson spoke as if he were giving a briefing, not revealing a secret that had been hidden for 40 years. This was not the confession of a guilty man, it was the explanation of an engineer. The manifest room came first, records floor to ceiling, physical and digital both. Nelson pulled the primary manifest, a bound volume nearly the twin of the one under Villeneuve's arm, and set it on the table between them. 40 years, every vessel that had entered the sector, date of entry, species of origin, vessel class, condition on capture, current status. Villeneuve opened his ledger to the first page and read the entry aloud, name, class, crew, date, into the formal cadence of remembrance because that was what the entry was for. Nelson turned the manifest to the matching record without looking down at it. He knew the page. He knew every page, and it became apparent over the next hour as they went through all 31 of them, the human matching each of Villeneuve's dead to a line of living ink. Refitting and operational, under repair, cannibalized for parts, stated in the same even tone as the rest, a fact and not a confession. 3 entries were flagged in a different color, the low Ryan vessels. Nelson closed the manifest with his hand flat on the cover. I would like to show you something, he said, before we discuss those 3. The observation gallery looked out over the interior docking bay. The bay was the size of a small city and it was full of ships. Villeneuve recognized classes from a dozen species. Then he recognized vessels, specific vessels whose loss he had filed personally, whose notification letters he had written with his own hand as a young officer. Hulls he knew from photographs clipped to grief reports. Here lit, maintained, reflagged in human colors, some of them visibly improved upon. The pale current sat in a cradle with her drive housings open, her registry repainted, and she had never in 40 years of his believing otherwise stopped existing. Somewhere on his home world there were 2 letters in his own handwriting explaining that she was gone. He made no sound. He stood at the gallery window and looked at the fleet for a long time, and his membranes closed once slowly and opened again, and that was the whole of what he permitted the moment. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. The humans had not merely captured ships, they had maintained them, improved them, integrated them into a functioning fleet. They had built a community around them, a civilization in the dark. The ships were not trophies, they were assets. They were not relics, they were tools. And the crews were not prisoners, they were residents. They had been given a choice to stay or to leave, and many had chosen to stay. The Pale Current was not a ghost ship. It was a working vessel, its drive housings open for maintenance, its registry repainted in human colors. It had been given a second life that its original owners had never imagined. The grief that Villeneuve had carried for 30 years, the weight of those notification letters, the texture of that paper was suddenly, impossibly obsolete. The ships were not lost. They were found. The entry did not resolve. It opened into something larger and more complicated than any word he had. Villeneuve's first question when it came was why no one had ever come to claim them back. Nelson's answer had no triumph in it. Because no one knew there was anything to claim. The manifest was not a public record. The losses had been filed as natural disaster by the people who suffered them. And to the rest of the galaxy, these ships did not exist anymore. His second question was how many species knew of this operation. 1, Nelson said, just us. His third question was the crews, and Nelson, instead of answering, took him down to the residential levels. The station had a population, several hundred individuals from more than a dozen species on decks, that had the worn, comfortable texture of a place where people had lived a long time and stopped thinking of it as temporary. There was a school, there was a market with prices argued in several languages at once, and a notice board offering drive parts, music lessons, fresh produce and someone's outgrown boots. There were children, some of them born here, running a corridor with the entitlement of natives. And there was a Savanlorian, chief engineer, deep naval blue gone deeper with age, darkest at the joints, who had arrived 9 years ago aboard one of the 3 flagged entries, and who now commanded a workshop the size of a hangar, a team of 12, and a standing argument with Nelson about drive calibration that both of them plainly maintained for the pleasure of it. He did not look like a man waiting to be rescued. He looked like a man who knew where every tool in the room was and had opinions about most of them. Villeneuve asked him directly, "Do you want to leave?" A Savan considered it with genuine seriousness. He said that the secondary drive housing on the 3rd low Ryan vessel had been running 2% low since the refit, that it had been bothering him considerably, and that he intended to finish the calibration. After that, he said, "I am open to discussing the question." Villeneuve filed the answer. He did not yet know which column it belonged in. He was beginning to suspect his ledger did not contain the column. The crews were not prisoners. They were not hostages. They were people who had arrived under traumatic circumstances and had, over time, built lives. Some had stayed by choice, some had simply stayed, and from the outside the two were indistinguishable. The station had become a home, not a prison. The ships had become a fleet, not a collection. The sector had become a wall, not a hazard. And the word that described it, the word the humans had used for millennia, was prize. It was not trophy because no one had been shown. It was not salvage because nothing had been wrecked. It was not conquest because nothing had been declared. It sat between all three and meant something that needed all three to approach and none of them to define. Villeneuve's language, which had a word for every way a ship could be lost, had no word at all for this way of being found. That evening, Nelson took him to the outer observation deck, the one that faced the sector and not the fleet, and turned the lights down without being asked. The creatures were visible from there, not as a sheet now, not as a skin over a dying hull, but as themselves, drifting in slow colony rivers through the dark, feeding on the thin ambient energy of the volume, the way grazing animals feed on a sparse plain. From this distance they were beautiful, a faint translucent shimmer across the black, pulsing in long patterns. And Villeneuve found that he was already beginning to read the patterns, the way one begins to read a current after enough hours on the water. And he filed it. Nelson told him how it started. It had not been a plan. He said it had been an accident. The first vessel ever to take the corridor had been a human survey ship, undermanned, under-equipped, behind schedule, and her master had read the empty charts and taken the sector as a shortcut because it was there and nothing said otherwise. The drain began 2 hours in. The crew did what trained crews do, which was push the drives to compensate, and the drain rose to meet them. And the ship was dying by the same patient arithmetic Villeneuve had watched climb his own displays. One crew member read the arithmetic differently, a junior navigator, second posting, who looked at the curves and saw a feeding instead of a failure, and who convinced the captain with 30 seconds left to decide and every officer senior to him objecting to order full power down. The ship went dark, the creatures settled into a low feed on her cooling systems, and the crew sat in that darkness for 6 hours, waiting to die, while the junior navigator stood at a viewport and watched the things feeding on his ship's energy, and took notes. He survived. He came back with a science team, then a longer posting, then a music library, a broadcast array, and a theory. Along the way came the discovery that mattered most, that the creatures answered specific frequencies in both directions, drawn to some outputs and repelled by others, and that a vessel tuned to the right standing signature could cross the sector without ever being touched. Human ships ran that signature now as routine output. The swarm let them pass the way a river lets a stone sit in it. That junior navigator, Nelson said, was me. He had been here for all 40 years the sector had been on the hazard charts. His survey ship had been the first vessel ever to take the corridor. The mystery and the man were the same age, and every one of the 31 entries in Villeneuve's ledger had happened on his watch. Villeneuve stood with that for a while. The accident and the architect were the same person, and the sector had never had two stories, only one. The origin of the mystery was not a cosmic phenomenon, it was a human being. A junior navigator who had refused to panic, who had observed, who had learned, who had built an entire operation around what he had discovered. The sector was not a natural hazard, it was a human asset. The galaxy had been going around it for 40 years, and all the while humans had been sitting inside it, asking questions, building a home. Villeneuve asked about the music. Why that piece? 2 years of trials, Nelson said. They had tried everything, classical works, military signal patterns, industrial output, pure sine sweeps. Nothing produced more than a local stir, until the day someone in the science team, for reasons Nelson described as cultural, broadcast a piece of old human music called Thunderstruck, and the entire test swarm crossed 9 kilometers in 90 seconds and wrapped the array like a fist. The working theory held that the opening build of the piece escalated in a pattern resembling in some electromagnetic sense a bloom of stellar radiation the creatures had evolved to chase. Nelson offered the theory with the honesty of a man who knew the difference between a working theory and an explanation, and then said the only thing he was sure of: it works. The implications were profound. The creatures were not mindless. They were responsive. They had evolved to chase specific patterns of energy output, patterns that, in their natural environment, indicated the presence of something worth consuming. The music worked because it mimicked those patterns, triggering an instinctive response that overrode all other considerations. The humans had not conquered the creatures, they had learned to speak their language. They had found a frequency that the creatures could not ignore and had used it to control them. The sector was not a wall, it was a door, and the humans held the key. The music was not just a tool. It was a symbol, a piece of human culture that had become a strategic asset, a weapon, a salvation. It was absurd and brilliant in equal measure, and it worked. That was the only thing that mattered. Villeneuve asked his last question, the creatures. What do you call them? Nelson told him. ACC. Villeneuve did not know the reference, he did not know the band or the terminology or the joke, and he heard something in the word regardless, a pulse, a charge, the signature of a thing named by someone who had understood it well enough to laugh. He heard somewhere under it the music that had peeled them off his hull, the opening build of something he would never entirely understand and never entirely forget. He closed the ledger. The name was a joke, a reference to the music that had saved them, a piece of human culture embedded in the very label of the species that had made survival possible. The creatures were not ACC in any scientific sense. They were ACC because that was the name of the band that had played the music that had tamed them. It was absurd, it was brilliant, it was human, and Villeneuve did not fully understand it, but he heard the pulse in it, he heard the charge. He heard the signature of a thing named by someone who had understood it well enough to laugh. The 40-year mystery of the Bristol sector was not solved by science. It was not solved by investigation. It was solved by a species that refused to accept the obvious answer. The galaxy had looked at the sector and seen a hazard to be avoided. Humanity had looked at the same sector and seen a puzzle to be solved, a resource to be exploited, a home to be built. The 31 ships were not lost. They were found. The crews were not dead. They were living, working, raising children, arguing about drive calibration. The sector was not a graveyard, it was a prize. And the humans had been collecting it for 40 years, quietly, patiently, without anyone ever knowing. Villeneuve's ledger, that physical book of grief, that weight of memory, had recorded every loss as a final entry. But the losses were not final, the ships were not gone, the crews were not dead, the entries did not resolve, they opened. And the word that opened them, the word that had no equivalent in his language, was prize. It was not trophy. It was not salvage, it was not conquest, it was something else entirely. Something that needed all three to approach and none of them to define. Villeneuve closed the ledger. He did not cross out the word lost. He did not write over it. He simply closed it. The mystery was solved, but the answer was not what he had expected. The answer was not a clean final state. It was a door, and beyond the door was something he would never entirely understand and never entirely forget. Something human. The galaxy would continue to go around the sector. The charts would still mark it as a hazard. Traffic would still avoid it, but Villeneuve knew the truth now. The sector was not empty, it was full. The mystery was over, the question was answered, and the answer was humanity. The Bristol sector incident represents a paradigm shift in interspecies relations and strategic doctrine. The human operation, a 40-year campaign of prize-taking and cultural integration, demonstrates a form of warfare that the galaxy had never anticipated. The humans did not conquer the sector, they befriended it. They did not defeat the creatures, they learned to speak their language. They did not capture the ships, they welcomed them. The operation was not a military campaign, it was an act of patience, observation, and adaptation, qualities that the galaxy had not associated with humanity. The implications for galactic politics are profound. If humanity can operate in the Bristol sector undetected for 40 years, what else are they capable of? If they can turn a lethal environment into a strategic asset, what other hazards have they converted into tools? The galaxy's assumptions about humanity, that they are a minor species, a newcomer to the stars, a participant in a distant war, are suddenly dangerously inadequate. Humanity is not a minor species, they are a patient one. They are a species that sits in the dark and takes notes. They are a species that turns accidents into operations. They are a species that builds homes in the most lethal places in the galaxy and raises children who run through corridors with the entitlement of natives. The word prize is key to understanding the human operation. It is not a military term in the traditional sense, it is a legal and economic one. It suggests ownership through superior skill, through cleverness, through the ability to outmaneuver. The humans did not take the ships by force. They took them because the ships entered their domain and the humans had the ability to claim them. The ships were not stolen, they were won. The crews were not enslaved, they were integrated. The operation was not a crime, it was a transaction. And the galaxy did not even know the transaction was taking place. The humans were not hiding, they were simply operating in a place where no one else would go. The sector was their home and they had built it into a fortress. The mystery of the Bristol sector is not the creatures. The creatures are simply animals, beautiful, terrifying, and ultimately predictable. The mystery is the humans. The mystery is why they stayed. The mystery is why they built. The mystery is why they took the risk. The answer, as Nelson explained it, is simple. They saw an opportunity. They saw a wall that could become a door, a hazard that could become a prize, a sector that could become a home. And they built. They built a station the size of a city. They built a fleet from captured ships. They built a community from alien crews. They built a culture from the wreckage of the galaxy's assumptions. And they did it all in the dark, where no one was looking, where no one would ever think to look because no one else would ever think to stay. The Bristol sector is not a mystery anymore, it is a lesson. It is a lesson in patience, in adaptability, in the power of observation. It is a lesson in the value of asking questions and taking notes. It is a lesson in the difference between going around and going through. And it is a lesson that the galaxy would do well to learn because the humans are not going anywhere. They are in the dark and they have been there for 40 years and they are not done building. They are not done collecting. They are not done turning hazards into prizes. The galaxy thought the sector was empty. The galaxy thought the ships were lost. The galaxy thought the mystery was unsolvable. The galaxy was wrong. The sector was full. The ships were found. The mystery was solved, and the answer was humanity. Thank you for watching my videos. Make sure to subscribe and comment for good luck.